Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Thank you so much for choosing today's breakout session on repairing the US-Iran broken relationship. My name is Kelsey Davenport. I'm the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where I lead our organization's work on Iran. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by Mary Kaszynski, the Deputy Director for Policy at Ploughshares Fund. Mary leads Ploughshares Fund's work on Iran. She is an expert on the JCPOA and has considerable experience discussing the nuclear deal and US policy towards Iran on the Hill. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mary. So I'm going to kick off today's discussion by talking a little bit about the current status of the JCPOA and what steps will be necessary for Iran to take to return to the deal. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who's going to talk a little bit about the US side and what Congress may do that either helps the United States return to the JCPOA or hinders the US return to compliance. So to dive right in, just to recap quickly, the status of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. So just to remind everybody, the JCPOA was implemented fully by all parties for more than 2 years, from January of 2016 to May of 2018. And at that point, US President Donald Trump decided to withdraw the United States from the deal and reimpose sanctions on Iran, despite his own intelligence community acknowledging that the deal was working and Iran was abiding by all of its commitments. And that really kicked off a US pressure campaign that initially the Trump administration said was designed to push Iran to negotiate not just on the nuclear issue, but also on a range of other areas that the US finds Iran's activities to be problematic, such as ballistic missiles and Iran's activities in the region. But what this maximum pressure campaign has really evolved to become is an effort to deny Iran any benefit of remaining sort of in the JCPOA. It became quite clear early on that Iran was not going to negotiate with the United States unless the United States first returned to compliance with the JCPOA. And so since then, we've just seen a ratcheting up of pressure that really is designed to either push Iran out of the deal and collapse the agreement altogether, or deny it any benefit of remaining within the agreement. So for about a year after the United States pulled out of the deal and reimposed sanctions, Iran worked with the other parties to the deal, the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China, to try to hobble together some sanctions relief that was really envisioned when the JCPOA was negotiated. And despite efforts from the Europeans, Russia and China, they were really sort of unable to realize any relief envisioned by the JCPOA because of the breadth and the strength of the US sanctions. So after a year of trying to make the deal work, Iran began to take a series of steps to violate the deal kind of in response to the US pressure campaign. And between May of 2019 and January of 2020, we saw Iran take 5 steps to violate the deal. As a result, now we've seen Iran stockpile its stockpile of low enriched uranium grow to more than 12 times the limit imposed by the JCPOA. Iran has slightly breached the limit on enriching uranium to only 3.67%. They've enriched now to 4.5%. They are no longer adhering to limits on research and development for advanced centrifuges. So they're deploying and operating more advanced centrifuges than allowed by the JCPOA. And they've resumed enrichment at the Fordo facility, which had been used for uranium enrichment prior to the deal, but as a result of the JCPOA was being modified into a research and development facility for stable isotope production. So in total, if we look at the series of violations that Iran has taken, they are concerning, but what's notable, I think, is that Iran has shown considerable restraint in how it's violated the JCPOA. These are very carefully calibrated steps that are designed to first press the Europeans and the other parties to the deal to deliver on sanctions relief. And then secondly, I think to provide leverage to push the United States to return to the JCPOA. Iran has been very careful not to cross any sort of red lines that would collapse the JCPOA, such as reducing compliance with international inspectors. It's maintained throughout this period all of the enhanced monitoring and verification mechanisms put in place by the JCPOA. Now, as a result of these violations, the risk posed by Iran's nuclear program has increased somewhat. When the JCPOA was fully implemented, it would have taken Iran about 12 months to produce enough fissile material for one bomb if they chose to do so. As a result of these violations, that timeline is now down to 3 to 4 months. So it is more concerning, but that still is plenty of time to restore full compliance with the JCPOA. So it's important to note that there's still time for diplomacy, sort of when assessing the threat posed by these violations. And it's also important to note that Iran has stated on multiple occasions that it's willing to return to full compliance with the JCPOA if the United States does the same. After President Biden, or Vice President Biden, won the election, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, said clearly that the U.S. and Iran could return to compliance without any negotiations. It could just be done automatically. So Iran has clearly messaged that it is willing to reverse all of these steps, and these steps are largely reversible, with the exception of some of the research and development knowledge gained, if the United States is willing to do the same. And in our assessment, Iran could reverse its actions, quite quickly. Right? In about 3 to 4 months, Iran could easily dismantle the excess centrifuges, blend down or ship out its excess LEU, and return Fordo to a research and development facility and sanitize it of any uranium. So this is a very doable sort of on the nuclear side. I would note, though, that there are a few things that could complicate Iran's return to compliance, and there are 4 that I think are particularly important to note. First, as part of its violations, Iran has introduced new advanced centrifuges that aren't covered by the JCPOA. Now, the Joint Commission, the body that oversees implementation of the deal, could decide and agree to allow Iran to test limited numbers of these machines, but addressing those new centrifuges that aren't covered is something that will have to be taken care of before Iran can sort of return to full compliance. Iran could also disable the machines, and that would be another way to return to its obligations, but that's an area that needs to be worked out. Second, there's a question about IAEA investigations into past Iranian nuclear activities. Now, as I noted, Iran has adhered to all of the enhanced monitoring and verification mechanisms put in place by the JCPOA, but the IAEA has noted on several occasions that Iran has not cooperated fully or timely with its investigation into past nuclear activities. And these are things that Iran did as part of its organized nuclear weapons program sort of prior to 2003. So if those investigations into past activities, cause Iran to not be in full compliance with its international safeguards obligations, that could complicate a U.S. return politically. It'd be hard for Biden to rejoin a deal if Iran is in violation. The third thing I would note is that, just over the weekend, a prominent Iranian nuclear scientist who was tied to that weapons development program pre-2003 was assassinated. And Iran has said that Israel was behind the assassination of Fakhrizadeh. So if Iran retaliates for this assassination, that could spark a cycle of conflict in the region that could, that the JCPOA could become a casualty of that. Or Iran could choose to retaliate sort of in the nuclear space. It could accelerate certain nuclear activities. And if it takes steps that are not reversible, or that Europe views as a red line, then that could make it more difficult to return to compliance, to the JCPOA. Now, the good news is that, as I said, Biden has said very clearly that he is interested in returning the United States to compliance if Iran is willing to do the same. And Mary's going to talk more about that. But just I would note quickly 3 things that he could do right away that would facilitate Iran's coming back into compliance in the nuclear space. First, he could reinstitute nonproliferation waivers for cooperative projects that are specified in the JCPOA. And I think this is very important because even, the Trump administration issued some of these waivers, for a year after pulling out of the JCPOA because they acknowledge that these projects benefit U.S. nonproliferation interests. And these are projects like converting the Iraq heavy water reactor, converting the Fordo facility. But if the U.S. reissues these waivers, it will help Iran return to compliance with the deal more quickly. It can facilitate shipping out excess uranium, Russian assistance at converting Fordo, and it benefits the United States. So that's a good sign of good faith. Second, I think the United States needs to indicate again that it supports Resolution 2231. That is the resolution unanimously passed by the Security Council that supported the JCPOA. And the Trump administration tried to use a provision in that to snap back UN sanctions on Iran this fall. They failed because the US is no longer a participant in the JCPOA. But the United States under Biden, really needs to clarify where it stands on that resolution to kind of restore credibility. And third, I would say that the US could offer to buy any excess heavy water as a sign of good faith. Heavy water is something, that Iran produces and has produced in excess of the limits. It's not a proliferation risk on its own because the reactor that Iran uses for that heavy water isn't online yet. But if the U.S. did that, it could help Iran, stay below that limit, and again, just be a sign of good faith. So from a nuclear perspective, like I said, returning to the JCPOA is very doable on the Iranian side. There are some obstacles that we need to look out for, but largely Iran's violations, while concerning, are largely reversible or can be addressed. And returning to the JCPOA, is very important because this is an effective, verifiable deal that blocks Iran's pathways to nuclear weapons. It can stave off dangerous nuclear competition in the region, and it can create time and space to negotiate a longer-term framework on Iran's nuclear program. So I'm now going to turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit about the steps that the United States needs to take to return to compliance and where Congress kind of fits into that picture. So Mary, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thanks so much to all of our attendees. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, please go ahead and answer that. Type that into the Q&A box, and Kelsey and I will do our absolute best to get to all of those before our session ends very soon. So diving into this question of what the US needs to do to come back into compliance with the nuclear agreement. In contrast to Iran, whose breaches have been very minor and calibrated to really pressure the US to come back in, the US approach has been a complete abrogation of the nuclear agreement. So President Trump deliberately and very publicly withdrew the US from the nuclear agreement, ceased US participation, and reimposed all of the sanctions that the US was required to lift under the nuclear deal. The Trump administration went a step further then. They not only reimposed the nuclear sanctions, they imposed sanctions on almost every element of Iran's economy and Iran's interactions and trade with the outside world. So the US abrogation of the JCPOA, again, has been complete on all fronts. They have imposed sanction after sanction, multiple levels and layers of nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions on Iran. So in order to come back into compliance with the nuclear agreement, there are certain steps that the Biden administration can and should take in terms of reaffirming the president-elect's commitment to rejoining the nuclear agreement, as Kelsey has noted. There are confidence-building measures that the US can and should take to help Iran come back into compliance. But the most important and absolutely essential element of the US returning to compliance with the JCPOA is for the US to lift those sanctions that have been reimposed under the Trump administration that the US was required to lift under the terms of the agreement. The real sticking point when it comes to the US return to compliance will be that the US must lift not only those nuclear sanctions that we were required to lift under the JCPOA, but also additional sanctions that the Trump administration has layered on. These are non-nuclear sanctions. So for example, there's sanctions that come under the label of Iran's support for terrorism or Iran's human rights abuses, all of which are legitimate concerns, legitimate problems that we have with Iran. The problem is that these sanctions were not imposed with the intent of addressing Iran's problematic behavior. They were imposed sort of as an excuse to try to prevent the Biden administration from rejoining the JCPOA and resuming diplomacy with Iran. So these are essentially non-nuclear sanctions, nuclear sanctions under a non-nuclear guise. So non-nuclear sanctions ostensibly, but in fact nuclear sanctions. And again, the US is required to lift those to come back into compliance. When it comes to the role of Congress, again, the sanctions are a real sticking point. The Biden administration can lift and waive all of these sanctions under executive action, but politically speaking, members of Congress could make it difficult for the Biden administration to return to full compliance with the nuclear deal if they object, from a political communications perspective to lifting non-nuclear sanctions on Iran. So it's really important as we look ahead, particularly as we expect that tensions may rise during this transition period, tensions between the US and Iran. It's really important for supporters of diplomacy, particularly in Congress, to be speaking out about the dangers of escalation and the importance of the US returning to full compliance in a phased process with Iran, working together to bring both countries back into full compliance with the nuclear agreement. And after that happens, resuming negotiations, some of these other issues, such as ballistic missiles. So I think I will stop there and turn to questions from the audience. Again, if you have questions, please type that into the questions box. Kelsey, while we're waiting for some questions to come through, I wanted to turn it back over to you. Actually, would you be interested in sort of expanding on the idea of future negotiations with Iran, some of those issues that we hope to address?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Mary. I think that's a really critical point. And that's something that President-elect Biden has said very clearly he wants to do, that he wants to return to compliance first with the JCPOA and then use the JCPOA to build a relationship with Iran and a set of negotiations on a range of issues. And I think that this is particularly important in the nuclear space because we do need a longer term framework to address Iran's nuclear program. A lot of key limits in the JCPOA are permanent, but there are some restrictions that start to expire in kind of the 10 to 15-year range, particularly regarding Iran's enrichment of uranium. So there are two ways that I think the Biden administration, could approach this. First would be just to negotiate a follow-on deal with Iran that extends some of those limits. That's one option, and the U.S. would need to put something on the table in return. Perhaps that's additional sanctions relief, more nuclear cooperation. There are a range of ideas. Another, I think, possibly more interesting but more challenging avenue, could be to look at some type of regional set of restrictions. We can't forget that the nuclear environment in the Middle East is very different now than it was in 2015 when the JCPOA was finalized. Saudi Arabia has threatened to match Iran's nuclear capabilities. Turkey has threatened to pursue nuclear weapons. Other countries are interested in developing sort of civil nuclear programs. So capturing some regional limitations, perhaps limiting or regionalizing fuel production and enrichment of uranium, all of those are options that the Biden administration can and should consider as they think about this follow-up set of negotiations. One thing I would note, though, is that we shouldn't expect the Biden administration to kind of do this right away. Iran has said very clearly that the United States need to return to the deal, restore credibility, and then negotiations can start. So I think it's critical that the Biden team starts to prepare for what that follow-on negotiation looks like, that they consult with Congress, that they think about Iran-specific versus regional strategies, and then once Iran is ready, perhaps after their presidential election, which is in June, then those discussions building on the JCPOA could commence.
I think that's a really important point, in particular about the Iran presidential elections, which happened, it almost coincides with the first 100 days of the new Biden administration. So there's very clearly some urgency here to get both parties back into compliance with the nuclear agreement before we start to talk about those follow-on negotiations.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got a lot of questions here about the recent assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist. Kelsey, maybe you can, I would just note that I think it's really important that Iran's knowledge and their, the research that they have done into their nuclear weapons program prior to 2003, and then, some potential dual use, research and development that they've done since then. Their knowledge about nuclear weapons did not reside in one person. So I think it's pretty clear that this assassination was likely more politically motivated and not really, sincerely an attempt to address the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. And, Iran has not responded directly yet, but, one would hope that they will continue to exercise some patience and restraint, and, engage with the Biden administration after January 20th in good faith negotiations to bring both parties back into compliance.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Mary. And I think you raise a very important point. We should remember that the United States intelligence community assessed in 2007 that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability, meaning they have the technology and the know-how to build nuclear weapons, if they choose to do so. So, we can't put that genie back in the bottle, and killing a scientist, assassinating a scientist, even one as prominent in the program as Fakhrizadeh, is not going to undo sort of that knowledge. Could it set back, any efforts if Iran chose to pursue nuclear weapons? Probably, but it's not, a game changer. And, when we look at kind of the enormity of, this act, which, I would certainly view as a violation of international law, and the, how problematic it is in terms of potentially escalating the crisis between the US and Iran, of which, the JCPOA could be a casualty. I absolutely agree that this doesn't really change things on the nuclear side, and that it likely was very politically motivated, designed to box in the Biden administration, when it takes office in January, because Iran's program right now, does not pose an imminent threat. So there really was no reason to do this.
Absolutely. Kelsey, question from Amanda. Do you expect Iran will be willing to commit to longer-term agreements or pursue the development of nuclear weapons despite sanctions like North Korea?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because it gets at the important question about intent and motivation. As Mary and I just discussed, Iran could choose to build nuclear weapons sort of at any point because of the work that they've done in the past. So the question really is ensuring that the costs of pursuing nuclear weapons are so high that they exceed any benefits that Iran believes it would have if it actually chose to build a bomb. So I think that Iran's willingness to commit to longer term agreements, to longer term restrictions, really is going to depend on several factors. First, are they actually getting something for these restrictions? I mean, even prior to the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, Iran had raised concerns about the performance of sanctions relief. The US and the EU and the UN, had lifted sanctions, but entities were very slow to go back into Iran because they were worried about the sustainability of the deal, and because US sanctions had been, prosecuted, very severely on Iran in the past. So I think, if the United States and its, partners in the deal can tie Iran back into the global economy and then drive up the cost of Iran, so that if Iran, were to pursue nuclear weapons and then, all those ties would then be severed, then I think that starts to, change Iran's cost benefit analysis. So that addressing that motivation perspective, I think, is really important. But it's not just, the sort of the economic benefits, it's also the regional space. If Iran sees states in the region, threatening its security in a way that it thinks it needs to preserve that nuclear hedging capability, then it may be more difficult to get those regional restrictions. And that's why I think, pursuing, a parallel track to a longer term framework on Iran's nuclear program that addresses regional security issues could be important to complement any longer term restrictions, or pursuing regional nuclear restrictions to kind of tie all of that in together. And I think it's worth recalling that if we go back to the early days of the JCPOA's full implementation, Iran had expressed a willingness to negotiate sort of longer term restrictions that built on the JCPOA if it wasn't signaled out in the region. So it basically has said in the past, it may be willing to consider regional restrictions kind of in concert with other states. So that's why I think it's important that the Biden administration consider kind of a range of options when it looks at what that follow-on negotiation might be, to capture some of those motivational aspects, to ensure that we don't see Iran, think down the road, like North Korea did, that the benefits of having a nuclear weapon, outweigh the costs of, sanctions and international isolation.
Yes, we're coming up on time here, but I want to ask a really important question because it's come up a couple times in the Q&A. Kelsey, how long will this take?
To return to compliance? A lot of this is going to depend on political will. I mean, Iran could do this, very quickly, within 3 to 4 months, if they want to. And there are a few clear steps that Iran has to take. First, they have to ship out or blend down their stockpile of low enriched uranium to return to the 300 kilogram limit set by the deal. Second, they need to, dismantle and remove the excess advanced centrifuges that they've installed within the Iran's facility. And they need to stop enriching uranium at Fordo, kind of, and sanitize, that facility. And if they have excess heavy water, they need to ship that out. So those are kind of the main areas of action. And again, like I said, I think Iran could technically do that, in 3 to 4 months if they feel like they have that political motivation and impetus to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and just to emphasize on the part of the US as well, a lot of this is about political will. So the Biden administration could lift all of these sanctions with the stroke of a pen. That's all it takes. But it is a question of negotiations and the politics of all of this, right? So the US is going to be reluctant to lift all of these sanctions before Iran has come back into compliance. And that is the art of diplomacy, right? So I think, the really important thing and something to watch for is clear commitment from the US, after January 20th, that this is something that the president-elect is very committed to doing, as he laid out in the CNN op-ed earlier in the fall. Kelsey, I'm going to pull another question from the Q&A. Scrolling through, these are all great questions. Thank you all. Are the E3 doing enough to save the nuclear deal? Do you think the responsibility lies solely with the US?
Well, I absolutely think that the US bears the brunt of the blame because there was no reason for the United States to withdraw from the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions. And not only did this punish Iran, despite the fact that Iran was complying with the JCPOA, but it showed a blatant disregard for the security concerns of US allies, particularly European partners who said that the JCPOA was essential to their security. Now, I commend Europe for attempting to take some steps to facilitate legitimate trade with Iran by setting up channels that were immune to US sanctions. They set up a mechanism to try to facilitate that trade, but it really has proven to be sort of largely unsuccessful. There have been, I think maybe only 1 or 2 transactions that have actually gone through. So on one hand, I think that, that Europe, tried to take some good steps, but I also think that they could have stood up more to the United States. They could have threatened, perhaps to retaliate in terms of sanctions, in return. They could have, I think, provided a stronger sort of sovereign backing, for these insulated trade channels to actually put some weight behind that, to show companies that they would support them if they tried to engage in legitimate business with Iran. So I certainly sort of give Europe credit, but I think that they could be more proactive. And I hope that they are more proactive going forward, really urging, Biden, once he takes office, to take steps to quickly, return to the JCPOA and to lay out the US's strategy for how to engage with Iran down the road.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us and for these excellent questions. We're going to end this breakout session right now and send you all off to choose your next breakout session. So if you open the chat window using the button below this video, you will see links for the second block of the 25-minute breakout discussions. To join the breakout session of your choice, click on that link to jump into the breakout session. Again, please click the link in the chat. Please click the chat button at the bottom to see the links for and join one of those 3 breakout sessions that will begin very shortly. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you all again for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we really appreciate your interest and engagement in this topic. And we hope you enjoy your next session.